The keys feel cold and heavy in my hand, digging crescent moons into my palm. They're not the keys, not to the cabin itself, but to the old, rusted metal box bolted to the largest pine near the property line. Inside, spare keys, sure, but mostly old papers.
Deeds.
Leases. The history of the land holding its breath in brittle envelopes. I stand here, the damp earth seeping into my worn boots, and the air smells like pine needles and something else, something metallic and bitter, like fear. Or maybe victory. It's hard to tell the difference sometimes when your world is being rebuilt from ash. I lift the box lid, the hinges screaming like gulls, and reach inside. My fingers brush against the thick vellum of the land lease, signed generations ago. This is it. The anchor. The thing they couldn't take because they didn't even know its true power. Not until now. If you know this feeling, this fight for something precious, tell me where you are and what time it is in the comments below. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me tell these stories, helps more people find them. It means more to me than you know. Our life was quiet, comfortable, like a well-worn armchair. My husband, Thomas, was steady, predictable, an accountant, meticulously balancing ledgers both at work and, I thought, in our life together. We lived in a comfortable suburban house, but the heart of my world wasn't there. It was 2 hours north, nestled among whispering pines, overlooking a lake that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the sun. The cabin. It wasn't grand. Just worn timber walls, a stone fireplace that always smelled faintly of smoke, and windows that framed the world like living paintings. That cabin was my inheritance, not just bricks and mortar, but memory and blood. My grandfather built it with his own hands. My grandmother planted the wild roses that climbed the porch. Every scratch on the floor, every faded photograph on the mantelpiece, held a story. It was where I learned to fish, where I saw shooting stars for the first time, where I felt most connected to the people who made me. When my parents passed, they left it to me, not jointly to Thomas and me, but solely to me.
They knew what it meant.
It wasn't just property. It was the repository of our family's soul. Thomas liked the cabin well enough. He'd come up on weekends sometimes, fish, read. But I always sensed he saw it differently. As an asset, perhaps. A nice escape. He didn't feel the weight of the generations in the floorboards like I did. He didn't hear their laughter on the wind blowing off the lake. To him, it was a place, not the place. But that was okay, I told myself. We had our life together, and I had this sacred space, my link to the past, my refuge for the future. Life was good. Simple. The biggest worry was usually whether the roof needed repairing or if the squirrels were getting into the attic again. The first crack appeared subtly, like a hairline fracture in glass you don't notice until the whole pane shatters. Thomas started talking about money more often. Not in a worried way, but a calculating one. Investments. Maximizing assets.
Diversifying.
Our finances were fine, more than fine. But he'd pore over spreadsheets late into the night, a new intensity in his eyes. He'd point out how much property values had risen in the Lake District. How people were paying crazy money for even small plots. I'd nod. Maybe say something about how nice it was that our little piece of heaven was appreciating, never imagining he saw it as something to be capitalized on. Then came the conversation that changed everything. He brought it up over dinner, as casually as asking if I wanted more wine. He cleared his throat, didn't look at me directly. You know, the market for cabins up north is insane right now. I smiled. I know, isn't it great? Our little place is probably worth a fortune. He finally looked up, a strange, tight expression on his face.
Exactly.
A fortune. More than we ever thought. He paused, took a slow sip of water. The air in the room suddenly felt thick. I've been thinking, he continued, his voice low, measured. What if we did something with that? With the cabin? My smile faltered. Did something? Like renovate? He shook his head.
No.
Like sell it. The word hung in the air, heavy and cold, like a stone dropped into still water. Sell it? The cabin? My stomach clenched. Sell it?
Thomas, no.
That's That's not just a house. That's my family's. I know, he cut in, a touch of impatience creeping into his tone. History. Memories. I get it. But think practically, Sarah. We could take that money, clear the mortgage on this house, maybe even have enough left over to invest. Financial security. For our future. Our future. He spoke of it as if the cabin wasn't intrinsically part of it. I felt a wave of nausea. But it's mine, Thomas. My parents left it to me. It's not just a financial asset we can liquidate. It's sanctuary. He sighed, a carefully constructed sound of a reasonable man dealing with an emotional woman. And I appreciate that. But be realistic. How often do we even go up there? A few weekends a year? It's expensive to maintain. Taxes keep going up. It's sitting there, costing us, when it could be working for us. Costing us? It cost me practically nothing relative to what it gave me in peace and connection. Costing us felt like he was already laying claim to something that wasn't his to claim. I pushed my plate away. The food suddenly tasted like ash.
I don't want to sell it, Thomas.
It's not for sale. He leaned back, a flicker of something I didn't recognize, annoyance? Calculation. In his eyes. Just think about it, okay? Just promise me you'll think about the possibilities. I didn't promise. I couldn't. The thought was a physical pain in my chest. I went to bed that night with the chilling certainty that he had already thought about it. A lot. More than he was letting on. The well-worn armchair of our life together suddenly felt rickety, unbalanced. The days that followed were tense. He didn't bring up the cabin sale again directly, but his mood was different.
Distant. Preoccupied.
He was on his phone constantly, speaking in low tones, excusing himself from the room. When I asked who he was talking to, he was vague. Just work stuff, or an old college friend. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. Then came the letter. A standard manila envelope in the mailbox, addressed to me. It was from a real estate company in the Lake District. Inside was a formal offer. An astonishingly high offer, complete with glowing descriptions of the property and boilerplate language about seizing this golden opportunity. My hands trembled as I read it. How could they send an offer directly to me unless someone who knew I owned it had prompted them? Thomas was in the kitchen when I walked in, the letter shaking in my hand. His back was to me making coffee. Thomas. My voice was sharp, accusing. He turned, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of the envelope, but his expression quickly smoothed over. What's that? You know what this is, I said, my voice trembling with anger. An offer. For the cabin. How did they get my name?
How did they know to send this?
Did you talk to them? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Okay. Look, I might have mentioned the property to a realtor friend, just to get a sense of the market. I told you I wanted you to think about it. You didn't mention it, Thomas. You solicited an offer, without even telling me you were doing it. The knot in my stomach twisted tighter.
This wasn't just thinking about it.
This was action. Behind my back. It's just an offer, Sarah. You don't have to accept it. But look at the number. Think what we could do. He moved towards me, reaching out. I flinched away. Don't touch me. Tears pricked at my eyes, hot and stinging. You went behind my back. For something you know is precious to me. Something that isn't yours to sell. His face hardened. The placating facade dropped. It could be ours, Sarah, if you weren't so sentimental. It's just a building. It's just dirt. It's everything, I cried. The argument escalated, voices rising. He accused me of being irrational, of holding on to the past, of sabotaging our financial future. I accused him of betrayal, of disrespecting my family, of seeing everything through the cold lens of money. The comfortable armchair wasn't just rickety now, it was splintering. Despite my absolute refusal, the calls started coming. The realtor, earnest and pushy. Then other realtors, having heard the property, might be available. Thomas denied he was still talking to them, but I caught him once, whispering into the phone on the back deck, mentioning square footage and lake frontage. He slammed the phone down when he saw me, his face flushed with something that looked a lot like guilt, quickly replaced by defiance. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. It wasn't just about the cabin anymore.
It was about trust.
The foundation of our marriage felt like it was crumbling. I started sleeping in the guest room. The silence between us was louder than any argument. He acted like I was the one being unreasonable, the one jeopardizing our stability. While he was just trying to secure our future, his version of our future seemed to involve erasing my past. I consulted a lawyer, a kind, older woman named Eleanor with wise eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. I laid out the situation. The cabin is solely in my name. My husband is trying to sell it against my wishes, possibly even talking to buyers. Eleanor listened patiently, tapping a pen against her legal pad.
Okay, Sarah.
Legally, if the property is solely in your name, he cannot sell it without your explicit consent and signature. Period. Relief washed over me, weak-kneed. So, he can't. He can't finalize a sale contract. He can talk to realtors, he can try to market it, but it goes nowhere legally without you signing the deed. Thank God, I whispered. However, she continued, and the relief evaporated, this is still deeply concerning. His actions are clearly aimed at undermining your ownership and pressuring you into something you don't want. This isn't just about property. It's about his financial motives overriding your legal and emotional rights. It speaks volumes about the state of your marriage. We talked about options. A cease and desist letter to the realtors? Too confrontational. Might just escalate things with Thomas. A legal agreement between us about the property? Thomas would never agree. My options seemed limited to simply refusing to sign anything. But the pressure continued. Thomas became more insistent, more manipulative. He'd leave articles about the booming real estate market on the kitchen counter. He'd talk about hypothetical scenarios where we had financial freedom, thanks to the cabin money. He started making subtle threats, veiled comments about needing money for things I wasn't aware of, hinting that my refusal was putting us in some unspecified peril. There are costs you don't know about, Sarah, he'd say, looking stressed. This sale could solve a lot of problems. Problems? What problems? He was always so closed off about our finances, saying he handled it all, it was fine. Now he was hinting at hidden crises? It felt like another layer of manipulation. Was there really a problem, or was he inventing one to force my hand? The uncertainty gnawed at me. The stress was relentless. I lost sleep. My appetite vanished. Every conversation felt like a minefield. One evening, I overheard him on the phone again. He was in his study, the door slightly ajar. His voice was hushed, excited. Sign the initial agreement today, contingency, of course, her consent, but the buyer is eager, cash offer, just need her signature. Yeah, pushing her, she's being difficult, sentimental, but she'll come around, she has to. My blood ran cold. An initial agreement? Contingency? He wasn't just talking to realtors anymore. He had found a buyer.
He had signed something.
He was presenting the cabin as available, as is to sell, contingent only on getting my signature, which he seemed certain he could extract. He was selling the cabin out from under me, piece by agonizing piece, before I even knew the full picture. I stumbled back from the door, my hand over my mouth to stifle a cry.
He wasn't just thinking about it.
He wasn't just talking to realtors. He was actively selling it, marketing it as something that was available for purchase, sealing agreements, all without my knowledge, without my consent. He was presenting my family's legacy, my sanctuary, as a commodity he had control over. The betrayal was deeper, colder than I had imagined. It wasn't just disrespect. It was a calculated move to take something from me, to force me into compliance. Eleanor had said he couldn't finalize the sale without my signature. But he was setting the stage. He was making it a reality for the buyer, making it harder and harder for me to refuse without consequences, maybe even legal ones if the buyer decided to sue him, which would undoubtedly spill over onto me. He was creating a situation where saying no would become incredibly complicated and painful.
He was cornering me.
Deepening crisis. That's what it felt like. Every day the deadlines seemed to loom closer, the unspecified contingency on the sale agreement waiting for my signature. I felt a crushing sense of helplessness. Eleanor had told me he couldn't sell it without me, but he was doing everything short of forgery to make it happen. And the constant pressure, the subtle threats, the gaslighting, making me feel like I was the problem, was wearing me down. I started spending hours at the library, poring over legal texts, property laws, anything I could find about jointly owned assets, even though this wasn't joint. Separate property, real estate transactions. My eyes blurred, the legal jargon swam before me, but I was desperate. There had to be a way to stop this, a way to protect the cabin. One evening, buried under a stack of dusty law books, my mind wandering, I remembered something my grandfather used to say. He was a practical man, proud of his independence. He'd built the cabin, yes, but he'd always emphasized the land. The land is forever, Sarah, he'd told me, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Buildings come and go, but the land, you hold onto the land. I remembered snippets of conversations I'd only half heard as a child. Something about the land not being owned outright initially. Something about a long-term lease. But I'd always dismissed it, thinking the cabin and the land were one entity now. My parents had given me the deed to the cabin, the one I held. I assumed that meant the land too. But my grandfather's words echoed. You hold onto the land. I returned to the library, shifting my focus. I started researching the history of land ownership in that specific county. It was tedious work, digging through old records, property indexes, online databases that were frustratingly incomplete. Hours turned into days. Doubt crept in. Was I chasing a ghost? Had my grandfather just been speaking metaphorically? Then I found it. Tucked away in a digitized archive of county records, a reference to the original grant for the land. It wasn't a sale. It was a 99-year lease, signed decades before my grandfather even built the cabin. A renewable 99-year lease. My grandfather had renewed it, then my parents had. The lease was separate from the deed to the physical structure of the cabin. The ownership of the building and the right to occupy the land were distinct legal instruments. My heart pounded. This wasn't a ghost. This was real. The deed I held, the one Thomas thought represented everything, only covered the lumber and stone of the cabin itself. The right to have the cabin sit on that particular piece of earth came from the lease. I found the records for the lease. It was in my parents' names. And critically, the last renewal date was years ago. The next renewal wasn't for another decade. The lease was valid. But who inherited the lease? Land leases aren't always treated the same as real property deeds and wills. How had my parents transferred it? Was it mentioned in their will? I frantically dug out copies of my parents' will and estate documents. I found it. A specific clause, often overlooked because the cabin deed was the main focus. All rights and interests pertaining to the leasehold property situated at cabin address, including the remaining term of the current lease and the right to renew, are hereby bequeathed to our daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Miller.
Me.
The leasehold rights belong to me. Solely. Just like the cabin deed. But here was the crucial, devastating point. If the land lease was separate from the cabin deed, and Thomas was selling the cabin, what happened to the lease? Was it automatically transferred? Did the buyer assume it? The documents were unclear on that specific interaction in this historical context. A cold dread washed over me. What if selling the cabin structure, the primary improvement on the land, somehow complicated or even extinguished my rights to the lease? What if the buyer of the cabin, having acquired the building, could then challenge my leasehold rights, arguing they were implied or transferred with the sale of the structure? It was a legal gray area, dependent on the specifics of the original lease, the will, and current property law interpretations. A lengthy, expensive legal battle seemed inevitable if the sale went through. Thomas was selling the cabin structure. He was selling just the building, potentially leaving me with the empty shell of a land lease, and the buyer potentially claiming rights to the land by virtue of owning the building on it. It was a mess. A legal nightmare. Everything felt lost again. The loophole I'd found felt like it was closing, becoming a trap. The deepening crisis intensified. The date for the contingent sale was approaching. Thomas was acting more confident, less secretive, sensing, I suppose, that I was cornered. He started talking about packing up some of the cabin's contents, the things he deemed not included in the sale. He was already dismantling my past. I called Eleanor again, my voice flat, hopeless. I explained my discovery about the lease. She was quiet for a moment. That's complicated, Sarah, she admitted. A separate leasehold interest does add a layer. The buyer of the structure would likely argue that the lease transfers implicitly. You'd have a strong case, given the will explicitly leaves the lease to you. But it would be a fight. A long, expensive fight. In court. A court fight. Against Thomas, essentially, and the buyer he'd found. More turmoil. More stress. More uncertainty. The idea of my family's cabin, my sanctuary, becoming the subject of a bitter legal battle, picked apart by lawyers and judges, was unbearable. It felt like the ultimate violation. I hung up with Eleanor, the weight of the situation crushing me. There seemed to be no easy way out. Refuse to sign the deed? Thomas would cause a scene, potentially creating legal headaches with the buyer. Let the sale go through and fight for the lease in court? A protracted, painful process with no guarantee of success, and the cabin itself would likely be occupied by strangers while the legal battle raged. I sat in the silence of my home, the silence of a marriage that was already over in everything but name. I thought about my grandfather, about his words. You hold onto the land, not the building. The land. The land lease. It was mine. Explicitly willed to me. The right to occupy that land was mine. Separate from the building. What if I stopped trying to stop the sale of the cabin? What if I let him sell the building? The thought was terrifying, counterintuitive. It went against every protective instinct I had. But as I turned it over in my mind, a different kind of clarity emerged. Thomas wanted to sell the cabin. He had found a buyer for the cabin. He had signed an agreement for the cabin. His entire focus, his manipulation, his betrayal, was centered on the physical structure and the deed I held for it. But the land? He never talked about the land itself, only the value of the property, meaning the cabin on the land. He probably didn't even fully understand the separation of the lease from the deed. Or, if he did, he dismissed the lease as secondary, something that would automatically transfer with the building, or something I wouldn't understand or fight for. He was blindsided by my knowledge of his actions. Could he be blindsided by my inaction on his front, and my action on another? My mind raced. The lease. My right to the land. What did that right entail? It entailed exclusive use and occupation of that specific piece of earth for the term of the lease. It entailed the right to renew it when the time came. It entailed the right to decide who else could be on that land. This was the turning point. The slow burn of despair ignited into a cold, hard flame of determination. I stopped seeing the cabin as the object of the fight. The fight wasn't about the cabin structure anymore. It was about the land. My family's land. Thomas wanted to sell the building? Fine. Let him. But he couldn't sell the ground it sat on. Not if I actively held onto my right to the land. I went back to the county archives, but this time, my focus was sharp, purposeful. I found the original lease documents, the subsequent renewals, the record of my parents' estate transferring the leasehold rights to me. I needed official, certified copies. Proof. Irrefutable documentation of my right to that land. This was my secret project. While Thomas continued to make plans for the cabin sale, talking to the buyer, discussing closing dates contingent on finalizing the paperwork, getting my signature, I was quietly, methodically, building my case for the land. I didn't tell Eleanor exactly what I was planning, just that I was exploring an angle related to the lease. She sounded cautious, but I was past caution. I was operating on pure instinct and a burning need to protect what was mine. I spent days gathering documents, making calls to the county clerk's office, navigating bureaucracy. It was frustrating, time-consuming, but every certified copy I obtained felt like a brick in a wall I was building around the land. A wall Thomas couldn't see. A wall the buyer didn't know existed. The day of the scheduled closing for the cabin sale arrived. Thomas was dressed in a suit, looking far too pleased with himself. He asked me, with a forced lightness, if I was ready. Ready for what? To sign away my history? To validate his betrayal. "I'll meet you there," I said flatly. I wouldn't drive with him. I couldn't stand to be in the same car, breathing the same air, pretending we were a united front. He raised an eyebrow, clearly expecting me to refuse to show up, to make a scene. My quiet agreement seemed to disarm him slightly. "Okay," he said, a hint of suspicion in his eyes. "Don't be late. They're on a tight schedule." I drove separately, the packet of certified lease documents sitting heavy on the passenger seat. My hands were steady on the wheel. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath my resolve, but the determination was stronger. This wasn't just about stopping Thomas. It was about reclaiming something fundamental. The real estate office was modern, sleek, all glass and chrome. The kind of place that handles high-value transactions. Thomas was already there, chatting with the realtor and a couple I assumed were the buyers. They looked affluent, eager. Like tourists ready to buy a piece of someone else's soul. Thomas saw me enter and gave me a tight, expectant smile. The realtor, a woman with perfectly coiffed hair and a predatory gleam in her eye, gestured towards the conference room. "Sarah, so glad you could make it. We're all ready to finalize everything." I didn't return the smile. I walked past them into the room. A large table dominated the space, covered in stacks of paper. The deed transfer documents were at the top. A pen lay ready, waiting for my signature. I sat down, placing my packet of documents on the table, not opening them yet. Thomas sat opposite me, the buyers and realtor flanking him. He looked impatient. "Okay, Sarah, they're waiting. Just need you to sign here, and initial these pages." He pushed the deed towards me. The air was thick with anticipation. They expected me to hesitate, maybe make a last-ditch plea, or sign with visible reluctance. They expected me to be the emotional woman he'd described, difficult but ultimately compliant. I looked at the deed, the words blurring for a second. The cabin, the structure. He was selling the building. I took a deep breath. "I'm not signing that," I said, my voice clear and steady in the silent room. Thomas's expectant smile vanished. His face went slack with surprise, then tightened with anger. "Sarah, what are you doing? We discussed this. You said you'd come. The buyers are here." The realtor leaned forward, her smile strained. "Sarah, perhaps there's a misunderstanding? The price is excellent, a fair offer." "There's no misunderstanding," I interrupted, my gaze fixed on Thomas. "I understand perfectly what's happening here. You are attempting to sell property that belongs solely to me, against my express wishes, based on an assumption that you could wear me down or corner me legally." The buyer, a man with a florid face, spoke up, annoyance plain in his voice. "Look, we have a signed agreement with Thomas. Contingent on her signature, yes, but we were assured that was just a formality. Is there a problem?" "The problem," I said, my voice rising slightly, addressing the buyer directly, "is that you were misled. My husband signed an agreement to sell you a building, but he cannot sell you the land that building sits on." Silence. Heavy, disbelieving silence. Thomas stared at me, his eyes wide with shock. The realtor looked confused. The buyers exchanged bewildered glances. I picked up my packet of documents. "This cabin," I said, holding up the deed Thomas wanted me to sign, "is a structure. A building. Yes, I own it. Free and clear." I put the deed down. "But the land it occupies, the ground beneath your feet, metaphorically speaking, that is not owned by me via this deed. It is held under a long-term lease." I pulled out the certified copies of the lease documents, fanning them slightly. "This lease," I continued, my voice gaining strength, "grants exclusive rights to occupy and use that specific parcel of land for 99 years, renewable. This lease was granted decades ago, renewed by my grandfather, then my parents. And upon their deaths, all rights and interests pertaining to this leasehold property were explicitly bequeathed to me." I tapped the clause in the will copy.
"Solely."
"By name." Sarah Elizabeth Miller. I looked at Thomas, who was pale, speechless. Then back at the buyers. What my husband has attempted to sell you is a building. A very nice building, perhaps. But a building sitting on land that I have the exclusive legal right to occupy and control. A building you would have no legal right to access, no legal right to occupy, because you do not hold the lease to the land it sits on. The realtor finally found her voice. A lease? But that's highly unusual. We were given standard property documents. A deed. The deed is for the structure, I clarified, laying the lease documents on the table. The lease is for the land. They are separate legal instruments. My husband knew I owned the cabin deed. He focused entirely on pressuring me to sign that. What he failed to realize, or perhaps hoped I didn't know, is that the land lease is the fundamental right here. The structure is secondary. I looked at Thomas again. His mouth was slightly open. He finally understood. He hadn't just tried to sell my cabin. He had tried to sell a cabin that, without the accompanying land lease, was practically worthless to the buyer. A building they couldn't legally access or occupy. He had made a deal based on a fundamental misunderstanding or deliberate omission of the true legal status of the property. He hadn't just betrayed me, he had potentially committed fraud or, at the very least, gross misrepresentation to the buyer. The silence in the room stretched, thick with the weight of his dawning realization. The buyers looked furious, turning their gaze from me to Thomas. The realtor looked panicked, her career flashing before her eyes. I wasn't finished. I wasn't just here to stop the sale. I was here to reclaim my power. My parents will transfer the existing lease to me, I said, turning back to my documents. But leasehold interest can also be assigned or reinforced. Especially when the property is under contention. I pulled out the final document from my packet. It wasn't an old family paper. It was fresh, stamped, and dated today. Given the circumstances, I said, my voice unwavering, the attempted unauthorized sale of the primary structure on the land, the potential cloud this casts on my leasehold rights, and to ensure the clear and unambiguous continuation of my family's connection to this land for the foreseeable future. I have, this morning, exercised my right as the current leaseholder to formally renew the 99-year lease, effective immediately. This supersedes any previous term and ensures my exclusive rights to the land for the next 99 years. I slid the newly renewed lease, certified copy in hand, across the table. It landed with a soft rustle of paper, but the sound felt like thunder. You tried to sell the cabin? I said, looking directly at Thomas. Assuming you could force my hand on the deed. You focused on the building, the asset. But you forgot about the ground it sits on. The land was never yours to sell. And now, with this renewed lease, it is unequivocally, legally, exclusively mine to control for the next century. Thomas stared at the renewed lease document as if it were a venomous snake. He picked it up with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the official stamps, his name nowhere on it. His plan, his calculated betrayal, based on leveraging my presumed lack of knowledge and emotional attachment, had just spectacularly backfired. He hadn't just failed to sell the cabin. He had exposed himself as either ignorant or deceitful, left a potential buyer furious, and solidified my absolute, undeniable claim to the land for the next century. The thing he wanted to liquidate, to turn into fungible cash, had become legally untouchable by him. Not only could he not sell it now, he had made it impossible for anyone else to buy the building he'd just agreed to sell. The entire deal was dead, and he was the one who had killed it by being greedy and underestimating me. His face crumpled. The carefully constructed facade of the shrewd businessman, the concerned husband securing our future, shattered. His lower lip began to tremble. He looked from the document in his hands to me, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief, defeat, and self-pity. And then, Thomas, the man who had coldly plotted to sell my family's history out from under me, who had put me through weeks of agonizing stress and emotional manipulation, lowered his head and began to cry. Not loud, racking sobs of remorse for what he had done to me.
No.
It was a quiet, pathetic weeping. The sound of a man crying over his own ruined plan. Crying over the money he wouldn't get. Crying because he had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted by the person he thought was merely an obstacle. He wasn't crying for me, or for the sacred space he'd tried to violate. He was crying for himself, for his failure, for the consequences of his own cold ambition. The buyer stood up abruptly. "This is unbelievable," the man said, his voice tight with anger. "Thomas, we'll be hearing from our lawyer." They turned and walked out of the room, the realtor scrambling to follow, murmuring apologies and trying to salvage the disaster. Only Thomas and I were left in the room, the table covered with useless papers. The unsigned deed, the voided sale agreement, and my newly renewed lease, a testament to his folly and my quiet triumph. He sat there, shoulders shaking slightly, making small, sniffling sounds. It was a pathetic display. I felt no pity, only a cold, hard satisfaction. He had tried to take something invaluable from me, something that wasn't his to touch. He had played a calculated game, thinking I was too weak, too emotional, too ignorant to fight back effectively. He had underestimated the quiet strength born of fierce love and a deep connection to history. I gathered my documents, stacking the old lease, the will clause, and the new, certified renewal neatly. I stood up. Thomas didn't look at me. He just sat there, lost in his own pathetic misery. "It's over, Thomas," I said softly. My voice was devoid of emotion. There was nothing left to feel for him. The cabin isn't sold. The land is secured. And whatever was left of us. I think you just sold that too. I walked out of the room, leaving him alone with his tears and the ruins of his plan. The aftermath wasn't a sudden burst of joy or a dramatic confrontation followed by immediate peace. It was quieter. A profound silence settled over my life. Thomas and I separated, of course. There was no coming back from that level of betrayal, that level of calculated cruelty. He tried, initially, to blame me for ruining his deal, for causing him financial distress. He was still so focused on the money, so incapable of seeing the true cost of his actions. But the legal reality of the renewed lease, the potential repercussions from the angry buyers, seemed to finally sink in. He stopped arguing. The divorce was quiet, clinical. The house was sold. The finances were divided. The cabin and the land lease remained mine, untouched by his grasp. Returning to the cabin felt different after that. The air still smelled of pine and lake water, but there was a new layer, a scent of hard-won freedom. Walking the property felt like walking on sacred ground, reinforced by the knowledge that my right to be there was absolute, legally ironclad, for the next century. The victory was real, but it wasn't without cost. The marriage was gone, shattered by ambition and deceit. The man I had shared my life with had revealed a capacity for betrayal that I could never have imagined. That wound would take time to heal, perhaps it never fully would. The trust was irrevocably broken. But the land remained. The cabin stood. And I stood on the porch, the keys to the rusted box near the pine tree heavy in my pocket, lighter than the weight that had been on my shoulders for weeks. This place was safe now. Secure. Not just legally, but emotionally. It was mine, connected to my past, a foundation for my future. Thomas had tried to sell my history, but all he had managed to do was underscore its invaluable, unquantifiable worth and solidify my hold on it. The land, as my grandfather knew, was forever, and it was mine to keep. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight for something precious against unexpected betrayal, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't already, subscribing helps me bring more stories like this to life. Thank you for being here.